Hello everyone, and welcome to Pyanodons Mods. This is Otaku Showboat, and today we will be discussing niobium processing. Again, if you have been enjoying these tutorials thus far, please be sure to do all of the engagement and social stuff below the video. This series is of course supported by my patrons at patreon.com/otakushowboat. And you can, of course, support Pyanodon's mods development at patreon.com/Pyanodon. So, niobium. Today's updated tutorial is going to be in the light of the updates since the previous video, including the release of Pi Alien Life. So I will make note that there has been a hot air change in that we now have access to hot air based plate production for niobium, and early game urea is really the only other major difference here. The actual chain has not changed, so if you want to have a look and see how this looks in practice, you can have a look at the previous tutorial video where I go over this chain. Although a number of my comments about how to get the outside inputs for this chain have of course evolved and changed over time in light of all of the changes as well as changes to my own personal preferences. So, today we're looking at a 5-ore input on niobium, and I will explain as we go on why just 5. So why just 5? So niobium is unique in that it requires refined syngas in order to mine it. I'm not going to go over necessarily how to obtain said refined syngas in that video. That is going to be up to you to decide which method in which to get your initial refined syngas. And of course, if you're playing Pyblock at this point in time, you don't need to worry at all about refined syngas in order to get niobium, because it is tied together with borax through the quenching tower recipe, converting tar into borax and niobium. But in a standard Pi game, you will need refined syngas in order to get your niobium ore, and chances are you won't be able to really produce a ton of the refined syngas, at least not enough to get you into the full belt range, and I would highly suggest not building at that scale early on, because the plates themselves are not going to be used for much outside of pipes and buildings, and pipes for buildings. Niobium pipes are great, and their upgraded version of the multi-purpose pipes by adding plastic to them to niobium is better, are better, because they are immune to impact damage. They look like trash, but they are better in terms of their piped around distance as well as their complete immunity to impact damage. So do bear that in mind. Although niobium pipes, as they are the most beautiful of the pipes. They are very shiny, shiny pipes. You will want these. You will want niobium as soon as possible once you get into green science. Like, that is one of the initial goals of green science, is getting into niobium, because niobium will also unlock big power poles on top of the pipes, and it'll unlock the hydroclassifier building to do unslimed iron processing, as well as everything else that needs hydroclassifiers. So it's a really key ingredient that you'll need. So try to get this as soon as possible, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. It's a big milestone at green science to get into niobium. In fact, green science can basically be classified as pre-niobium and post-niobium. And then, of course, going into post stainless steel and post circuit 2s, which by then you're in chemical science at that point. So bear all of this in mind. So in this scenario, we have to jaw crush our niobium to get niobium powder. We'll have to deal with the stone somehow. Then we will take our ball mill to the niobium powder to make it into a fine niobium dust. and we'll have to deal with gravel after that as well. We will then classify our classiest of niobium dust into a niobium concentrate, as well as a little bit of sand. Notice how we're getting particulate here, smaller and smaller particulate stuff as byproducts. So then our niobium concentrate, here's where things get crazy. We will then have to take into a vanilla chemical plant our niobium concentrate, add to it organic solvent as well as hydrogen chloride. So organic solvent in the early game, you'll have a couple of choices, but my suggestion is always going to be acetone syngas, because not only does it output organic solvent, it also outputs ammonia. Now, at Green Science, at this point in Green Science, it depends on whether or not another milestone has been met, and that is whether or not you are pre or post phosphate processing. If you are pre phosphate processing, chances are there is an acetone recipe. So there is an acetone recipe that you have access to that gives you exclusively acetone. It costs chromite sand and copper and lead to actually do this recipe. It costs many things to make all the things that you need to get into just acetone. If you are post-phosphate processing, there is technically the phenol acetone recipe, but the cumene recipe, to get the cumene for the acetone phenol recipe, the cumene is through a process that involves phosphoric acid, which, yeah, you probably don't want to spend phosphoric acid at this phase in the game. You unfortunately will not get access to the other cumene recipe out of distillate processing until you get into chemical science. So you may want to consider doing Vat Brain Blue Science to get into that particular recipe, so that you can do the phenol acetone, which is significantly easier than doing the chromite sand recipe to get into just acetone. So with all of that said, that is my suggestion, and I do suggest keeping with this acetone syngas recipe, because even though the chromite sand, copper, lead stuff, all of that expense to get dedicated acetone is fairly expensive, every other recipe for organic solvent is even more expensive in terms of the space that you need at this point. And it also really depends on if you've set up a better build for your bone meal, and if you've set up zinc for activated carbon, etc., etc., etc. And if you are trying to blitz through this at Green Science, trying to get it as soon as possible, chances are you don't have zinc processing set up yet to get activated carbon. Chances are you don't yet have a major source of bone meal. You have some bone meal from Augs from making the Green Science in the first place, but chances are you don't have olefins and have to set up a thing for olefins, and you probably don't have the scale of bone meal to produce enough for the organic solvent here. So that's the thing, and you don't really have access to the arthropod blood stuff yet, anyway. And this is just a tiny byproduct trickle out of the fiberboard from your circuit production. So that's the next level of complexity. Like, even after refined syngas complexity, then you get organic solvent that you need to figure out an answer to, and then you also have hydrogen chloride that you need to figure out an answer to. Again, this can change depending on whether or not you're doing phosphate processing, because there is an option to get hydrogen chloride out of phosphine plus saline, converting 1 to 3 from your phosphine into phosphoric acid. This is a pretty good recipe. This is a pretty good recipe, and it's very decent on its hydrogen chloride output. You might want to consider this as a primary hydrogen chloride recipe. Just saying. Otherwise, lamps, hydrogen, chlorine, that's going to be fine for you for now. Then on top of all of that, you have the ammonia in the next step from your niobium complex. Note you're going to be needing niobium complex because that is your molten niobium, quote unquote. This is treated as your molten niobium. So, and there are a few alloys using this stuff as well. So, you're going to need to make sure that you have a supply station of this when that time comes. Loading in excess beyond the amount of plates that you need. Uh, so from here, the complex, you need to throw it into another set of chemical plants with ammonia. The ammonia at Green Science, unfortunately, is only going to be derived from urea. That is your only real option available to you at Green Science. There are many options that will become available to you, many much better options that will become available to you. Note that you will not have enough ammonia coming out of the organic solvent recipe. You will have nowhere near enough coming out of the organic solvent recipe to feed all of the ammonia that you need for this oxide step. So, yeah, urea. Urea is not so good anymore because it's in a standard pie game. You're only going to really be able to make this out of manure, liquid manure plus Zogna bacteria, in which at that point you're spending plates in the form of the lamps for the Zogna bacteria, you're spending wood for the Zogna bacteria, and you're spending a whole bunch of space for the manure to make the liquid manure. It's just awful in terms of the space per output in the early game. Just gonna keep saying that until the end of time. It's not going to change. Um, there are blood and wastewater recipes that exist for urea, but at Green Science, I don't see it as particularly worthwhile trying to slaughter an animal that otherwise makes manure to get blood, because then you have to spend cages. Then you're spending cages to get blood, etc. And in a standard game, you don't have access to fish processing either that would give you wastewater plus blood that you could spend on urea. You do, however, have access to that in Pie Block, but it's still going to be pretty big if you're resorting to using the basic fish farms, which have free power use. So do keep all of this in mind. It's really, really extremely heavy on the amount of urea that you need, way more than you'll ever be able to particularly consider producing at this phase of the game. So you're going to be making a trickle. You're probably not even going to have the ability to make 166.7 to process 5. You're probably only going to be able to get half of this at best. That is, of course, until you unlock at Blue Science the abiotic ammonia recipe. The abiotic ammonia recipe. This is your savior. This is the ultimate savior for niobium processing in particular. So basically, what I'm saying is get into that brain Blue Science as fast as you possibly can. You need guts and brains and silver and crude oil. That's about it. Guts, brains, silver, crude oil. Get into that Vat Brain Blue Science and get this recipe unlocked ASAP. Because it is going to be your ultimate savior. There are so many things that use ammonia in the process of getting into proper Blue Science at Green that will definitely be made a heck of a lot easier by having access to this recipe. So I highly suggest doing that Vat Brain Blue Science quickly, very quickly, to improve your outputs of everything and reduce the space that you need for this. It is always going to be more space efficient to do this nitrogen-based recipe than it is to do the manure-based recipes for urea. Always going to be better for that. And then, of course, there is two more actually, pieces of complexity here once we have our oxide, and that is the electrolysis casting. This is going to use a significant amount of salt. Fortunately, at Green Science, you do have access to mining of salt nodes on the map, so find salt nodes. Each mine, I should say, on a salt node is capable of outputting 10 items per second. Put a chest in front of the output of those machines to actually get the full 10 per second. Otherwise, you will be capping at a certain amount on your belts. Bearing in mind again what I said in the boron or borax processing video, that the way that these machines work is that they don't start a new cycle until they're they don't start a new cycle until the entire contents of their internal inventory of mined product has been removed from their inventory. So if you're throwing it onto a belt, it can't unload it fast enough on a belt, and it causes a delay in the beginning of the next cycle of the mine. So if you offload into a chest, it's able to offload all of the product instantly, basically in one step, one frame of the cycle. So it's able to just do it instantly and continue to mine. And if you have loaders, then you can just unload from that chest at the full 10 items per second of that mine. In this case, in this example, you would need at least 3 mines tapped worth of salt. In the alternative, you can make salt out of salt water. But again, that depends how you're getting your saline water. Are you getting your saline water out of stone? Which is viable, technically. If you have a lot of stone patches available to you, maybe you've taken the opportunity and you're using resource spawner overhaul, and you have drastically increased the size, density, and frequency of stone for this very specific purpose of making saline water out of stone that you then convert into the salt that you need on site, or you're just tapping a whole bunch of salt mines. My point being, it uses a lot of salt. It is very salt heavy for this process. And then, of course, now in the current state of the game, we have access to hot air production, processing of these plates. This is part of a broader hot air overhaul. Generally speaking, the hot air usually applies to molten casting, but this is one of the few exceptions. This is a very set process. It does not change over time. The only thing that changes over time here is that you are able to use productivity modules on every single step except the hot air casting recipe, which makes no sense whatsoever, but here we are. If you're using vanilla productivity modules, this likely will not have any impact on you because the amount of plates that you get by doing hot air in the first place is 25% better than otherwise. And if you're not changing the number of module slots in the buildings, over time the max amount of module slots at Mark IV buildings is 4. So if we take a look at if we have the vanilla productivity modules, which are 10%, okay, well that's 40% productivity at the cost of speed, at the benefit of energy. Then definitely, I would say, because this is only a 25% increase, if you do have at least Mark III buildings, access to Mark III buildings, it is no longer viable to do hot air casting of niobium. Just because at this moment in time, anything may change at any point in time. And that's with the level 3 modules too, by the way. Like, good luck. on level 3 modules, which are going to require intelligent units. So, like, sure, by the time you get to level 3 modules, the level 2s are 6%, at which point then, good luck getting to over 25%. But, yeah, it's definitely a thing that exists, a slight oversight that exists, and this exists with niobium and molybdenum processing, where you do have these hot air recipes now that give a flat 25% bonus, but their normal recipe without the hot air can take productivity, while this step can't with the hot air. It doesn't make any sense. This should take the productivity, considering that's the only way of improving the output as you increase your tech level for niobium and for molybdenum and for rare earth processing. Just to throw that out there as well. I think there's a few other things where that's also an actual intended process. But yeah, in the current state, that's the complexity with this hot air process. It's better to do the hot air process until such time as you can get greater than 25% productivity out from doing the not hot air process. Then it's better to just switch over to doing the not hot air process and using that productivity. Granted, to this point, we can continue improving the output here just by using the productivity on all the previous steps anyway, so there you go. There you go, and if you're using Bob's mods, well, forget it. Then it's pretty... The answer there is, like, as soon as you can get Bob's modules, you can basically hit that plus 25 pretty quick. Because by the time you can actually get modules, if you have Bob's modules installed, you have to have gold. You have to have gold first, so yeah, you're a little bit later in the game anyway, and you definitely have at least Mark II buildings by that point, which will have 2 module slots on them. And yeah, those modules that you get in Bob's modules are just supremely superior overall. But again, the moment you can get greater than plus 25% out of doing the productivity modules on the not hot air recipe, it's always going to be more viable to do that than to spend the hot air. Okay, with that, folks, I have now covered everything that I wanted to cover in regards to the niobium processing chain. I would, of course, like to thank you all for watching. This has been Otaku Showboat. If you have enjoyed this video and the tutorials thus far, please be sure to do all of the engagement and social stuff below the video. This series is, of course, supported by my patrons on Patreon at patreon.com/otakushowboat. And don't forget that you can also support Pyanodon's mods development at patreon.com/Pyanodon. I will, of course, see you all on the next one.